Hello, I would like to welcome you all to our session today on revolutionary emotions, panic, frustration and enthusiasm, 1789 to 1799. And I'm so delighted we have three really excellent speakers here today whom I'm certainly looking forward to hearing. I'm sure you are as well. Those speakers, of course, are Tim Tackett, Ian Coller and Rebecca Spang. We are starting today with Ian Coller, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of California at Irvine, author of many studies on the complex relationship between France, especially the French Revolution, and North Africa and the Islamic world. His published works include his book Arab France, Islam and the Making of Modern Europe, 1789 to 1831, and that came out with the University of California Press in 2010 and is available in French translation. Yes. He's currently working on a book manuscript on Muslims and citizenship in the French Revolution, which he's rethinking as a global event. So, over to you. Oh, sorry, his paper title is Turbans of Liberty, Revolutionary Enthusiasm and Global Emotions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. I'm starting today with a moment from the year 2 on 10th of Frimaire, just a small event that takes place in the National Assembly amongst so many deputations, was one composed of the children of the sans-culottes from the Parisian section of Arcis, who appeared at the bar to declare that they had abolished all signs of religion from their classrooms, that they had sent the sole surviving school bell to be melted down at the National Mint and now assembled only to the beat of a drum. Our young comrades of all religions, they declared, can now come and fraternize and learn with us without fear, said the 11-year-old Jean Poinsard. We no longer ask them before admission whether they are Jews or Muslims or Protestants. We do not bother them with the doctrine of a God they despise. We only ask them if they are or want to become patriots. So for me, this moment speaks at once to the ongoing centrality of revolutionary enthusiasm in the period we have come to call the Terror, and to the ways in which that patriotic enthusiasm was practiced on a stage wider than the local or the national. So Protestants and Jews were certainly present in France, although constituting less than 3% and 0.2% of the population respectively. Muslims were hardly present at all, and those individual merchants and diplomats who did take up residence were very, very unlikely to have brought their families and children. So these students had almost certainly never met a Jew or a Muslim, and very possibly not even a Protestant, much less welcomed them into the classrooms of their school. Why then did they mention them in their address? And they were not alone. Muslims, along with other non-Christian groups, were invoked on multiple occasions throughout this period. And I think it's in the realm of revolutionary emotions that we can best understand such declarations, but not simply as wild effusions driven by crazy flights of imagination, but rather as an emotional practice central to the nature and course of the revolution and conceived on a much more global scale. So this declaration certainly inscribed itself in the revolutionary language of enthusiasm. It was a language of emotion, of suffering, joy, eternal truths, clouds pierced by rays of light, regenerated people, salvation. It bore the hallmarks of a religious education, as well as the studies of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, to which the students proudly declared they now devoted themselves in between sessions of drill practice. But it was not from these sources alone that they drew their inspiration. They had not received these ideas about religion from their clerical tutors, nor from the Declaration of Rights. Indeed, instead, these works speak to something more general in the constitution of revolutionary emotions and of enthusiasm in particular. So enthusiasm, one may say, is the most naturally revolutionary of emotions. In fact, perhaps the defining emotion of revolution, without which we have no revolution. We have something between either reform on one side or rebellion on the other. And his seminal book on emotions, William Reddy, opens his chapter on the French Revolution with Madame de Staël's emphasis on the, quote, sincere and disinterested enthusiasm that she noted inspired the French, drawing from it a larger argument that he makes about sentimentalism. And for Reddy, this, quote, shared belief that sincere emotions were of great political importance, unquote, defines the emotional regime of the late 18th century and constitutes a fundamental driver of the revolution. But I want to suggest that to conflate enthusiasm with feeling as a whole is to neglect the specificity of both revolutionary culture and the social production of emotions. Emotions occupied a dialogical relationship with revolutionary circumstances, shaping the ways in which events were understood, but also transformed by those events. Radically new circumstances produced sudden and often surprising responses and redefined the understanding of emotional categories. Ordinary people came to understand emotions and, crucially, what these emotions implied in new and different ways. So we may say that enthusiasm itself, in this sense, underwent a revolution between 1789 and 1794. So enthusiasm entered the French Revolution trailing opprobrium, beloved of neither Enlightenment philosophers nor of the religious authorities. Following the English Enlightenment's disdain for the strange convulsion of refugee Seminole prophets in Britain after their flight out of France after 1685, Voltaire defined enthusiasm as signifying, quote, emotion of the bowels, internal agitation. And he claimed this was the Greek etymology, which was rather disingenuous. In place of divine inspiration, he suggested a more physical cause, quote, the vibrations experienced by the nerves, the dilation and shrinking of the intestines, the violent contractions of the heart, the precipitous course of those fiery spirits which mount from the viscera to the brain. Enthusiasm for Voltaire was a disease, a condition that could be traced in the stages of its passage to the body, quote, approbation, sensibility, emotion, distress, impulse, passion, transport, insanity, rage, fury. In contrast, he declared proudly, philosophers could never form a sect since they were, quote, without enthusiasm. And Voltaire particularly dramatized what he saw as the dangers of enthusiasm in his play about the Prophet Muhammad, Le Fanatisme ou Mahomet le Prophète, which became one of his most widely known and influential creations. Voltaire insisted, as he did in the Lettres philosophiques, that fanaticism was just a murderous form of enthusiasm. To adopt Simon Schama's expression, we may say fanaticism was enthusiasm with a body count. So this emotion was not only excessive, it was also duplicitous and self-interested, the instrument of the demagogue. This was a very influential position. Voltaire further distinguished between different forms of enthusiasm, which he considered all to be under the umbrella of fanaticism. The demagogic cynicism of the Prophet, the inflexible, ruthless action of the Omar, and the innocent, duped enthusiasm of the Seyyid. And these were terms that would re-emerge as codes for dismantling revolutionary enthusiasm after Thermidor, which I won't be talking about in this paper, but I'm happy to talk about it in the questions. So suspicion of enthusiasm was very evident in 1789. Just for an example, the clerical cahier of the Bailliage of Étampes warned against the effects of the, quote, empire of eloquence, or even the often dangerous enthusiasm of patriotism and liberty. Another pamphlet on the sovereignty of the people declared that, quote, the people's enthusiasm for its leaders is never long in becoming dangerous to its happiness. The Abbé Sieyès, in his hugely influential pamphlet, What is the Third Estate, insisted that enthusiasm was no more than the instrument of the aristocracy to whip up the people in order to make a distraction to maintain their privileges. Yet in just a few months, enthusiasm was transformed from a largely negative idea to a positive one. Observers like de Stael and Condorcet began to distinguish a positive, disinterested enthusiasm from this dangerous intoxication. In Germany, Immanuel Kant declared in an important 1790 text that was powerfully influenced by the letters he received from his friends who were in France, that although enthusiasm is an affect and therefore inimical to reason, it is redeemed by its association with, quote, the idea of the good. Unlike Voltaire, he insisted that this idea distinguished enthusiasm sharply from fanaticism. And this enthusiasm for enthusiasm was quite new and a feature of the revolutionary moment. It had little to do with a wider sentimentalism, and it was shared by those like Kant who expressed the greatest misgivings about emotion. This transformation in enthusiasm did not come about merely through the electricity of feeling. I would argue that it was the result of a series of pragmatic actions that struck at the assumptions that powerful feeling could only cloud judgment and lead to negative outcomes. Most crucial was the night of the 4th of August 1789, when deputies of the National Assembly rose one after another to propose the abolition of privileges and feudal duties, wiping away centuries of seigneurialism in a few hours. We may observe, wrote one journalist, quote, that the most important decrees, the greatest sacrifices, were the result of a kind of inspiration, a sudden enthusiasm of patriotic love. Although some had cause later to reflect bitterly on that night, no newspaper at the time reported this enthusiasm except in a positive light. Brissot wrote, quote, "It is impossible to give a true picture of the generous enthusiasm with which all hearts were set on fire. Acts of generosity and patriotism crowded one against the other and multiplied with such rapidity that it was difficult to follow them all." So the enthusiasm of the assembly was performed in acts of renunciation, creating concatenating waves of surprise and joy, prompting further sacrifices until, according to Gorsat, the deputies were so electrified, quote, that they would have sacrificed their lives. These actions did not remain confined to the 4th of August. They continued in the form of patriotic gifts volunteered by individuals, groups and communal organizations across the country, including the offerings of jewels and silver shoe buckles, renunciation of salary and even vacations. The word sacrifice appears over 1,500 times in the Archives Parlementaires from 1789 to late 1793, the period that we now have digitized that we can check. Gift and patriotic gift appear hundreds of times in late 1789 and 1790, but also continued through the Revolution. And the term enthusiasm demonstrates a consistent rise through the Revolution, with its peak in late 1793. Many historians have written on the revolutionary politics of self-sacrifice, where some have identified these acts with a long-term cult of the nation. Other historians have drawn attention to their implication in wider colonial, Atlantic, and European networks, for example, and my colleague Rebecca Spang has written on the actions of renouncing colonial luxuries like coffee and sugar at a moment when attempts to retain the colonies threatened the principles of equal rights, or the according of French citizenship to a list of foreigners as an act of generosity in August 1792 that Suzanne Dessin has so usefully written about. So these actions were not simply spontaneous outpourings of national emotion. They were political practices that served to articulate relationships between Paris and the provinces, between deputies and people, between French and foreigner. Gifts could involve requests, for example, to become a departmental capital, demands for inclusion as citizens, and in particular the articulation of belonging by foreign communities such as the Irish students and priests who offered up the silver of their chapel on the 8th of October 1789, or the 900,000 livres offered by Genevans in support of the revolution on 18th of December. Enthusiasm was the emotional frame that allowed these gifts to be understood as sincere forms of revolutionary practice and opened a political space for participation beyond the nation. On 19th of June 1790, a deputation of foreign communities appeared at the bar of the National Assembly, led by the Prussian Baron Jean-Baptiste Clout, requesting permission for foreigners to participate in the Festival of the Federation. These foreigners included Genevan, English and Dutch supporters of the revolution, but also representatives of Avignon and the colonies seeking greater integration with the new regime. This was a calculated piece of political theatre that solicited a place for ideologically aligned foreigners in the frame of the patrie. In place of patriotic gifts, however, this deputation offered a different performance, one that gestured to the global vocation of the revolution. The presence among the deputation of a number of individuals in conspicuous Muslim dress created an enormous sensation in the assembly, an allegorization of the human race, as Sophie Vanich has aptly described it. Even Clout cannot have anticipated the shockwave of emotion his coup de théâtre produced. The royalist Comte de Parois, who elsewhere called the deputation a grotesque masquerade, emphasized nonetheless its emotional impact. Quote, "The galleries, intoxicated with the joy of seeing the universe in the middle of the National Assembly, clapped their hands and stamped their feet. It is impossible to describe the cries of joy and noisy applause. The deputies imagined themselves already in a Paris that was the capital of the human race, the peoples of the earth rushing forth to admire the victors of the Bastille." At the peak of this heightened emotion, Alexandre de Lameth rose to deplore the monuments of Louis XIV crushing the provinces that were erected in the Place des Victoires, and these were swiftly ordered removed before the festival. Then, all at once, crying, "Today is the tomb of vanity," a deputy pronounced the unthinkable, a proposition to abolish all noble titles in France. Rapidly seconded by Lameth, Foucault, Lafayette, Noailles, and other nobles, the motion was passed. In the words of an observer, this was a second 4th of August, quote, "the same patriotic fervour, the same zeal, the same enthusiasm for the public good, the same sacrifices by the generous representatives of the French nation." It was above all the presence of Turbans in the deputation that had produced this wave of emotion, deeply connected both to the universalism of the revolution and to its struggles over religion. If Muslims had long been coded as figures of fanatical religious attachment, the apparent proof of their potential participation in the revolution appeared to promise a hope that transcended the looming struggles over the civil constitution of the clergy, formalized a few weeks later. Denouncing these Muslims as impostors became a priority of the emergent counter-revolution. In turn, turbans flourished as a leitmotif of revolutionary images, songs, and speeches. And I wish I had the slides to show you, but I have many, many examples of this in my book. So revolutionary enthusiasm was neither an effect of sentimentalism nor an empty rhetoric. It was an emotional code that framed an evolving set of political practices around sacrifice and renunciation, inclusion and universalism. To return in conclusion to the students of Arcis, Their enthusiastic invocation of Muslims served a purpose. The students were approaching the assembly for a decree of November 1792 that left them under the spiritual guidance of priests, and they pressed for a more radical anti-clerical agenda. The students did not call on Muslims to renounce their religion, but only to participate fully as patriots. Indeed, these Muslims, as Muslims, served precisely to resist what Mona Azzouf called the transfer of sacrality from Catholic to revolutionary ritual, and which has become, I think, the dominant model for understanding revolutionary enthusiasm, certainly in the form of festivals. I would argue this was not a transfer, but rather a translation of forms, investing them with a remarkable and rapid profusion of new symbols, ideas, and practices, including the turban. Not the renunciation of the world for a religious vocation, but its opposite, an articulation of active connection to politics and participation on a global scale.